Have you ever been given a tidbit of information by some old hand at gardening that's then changed the way that you garden forever for the better? Or have you been wondering, where do you get those tidbits of information that you can only really get through years and years of experience, or directly from other gardeners that have been gardening themselves for decades and decades, that seem to be hidden everywhere but you never seem to be able to get your own hands on? Well, over the years I've collected tons of these little bits of information that will make things fruit just that little bit earlier, seeds start just that little bit quicker, make gardening just that little bit cheaper, that are so sporadic and not really detached that I can't really put them into other videos. So I'm making this video entirely dedicated to as many of these tiny bits of information that should help one aspect of your gardening get way better really quickly. These are basically all of the really good tips that I know that I struggle to squeeze into other videos, so I've tried to pack as many of them into this one video as I possibly can. Now let's dig in. Don't even think about throwing away fallen leaves, especially through autumn. This stuff is something that all gardeners know is just absolute gold to add into your compost or even directly onto the garden. This stuff breaks down to become basically the best soil, better than anything you'd be able to buy. If you let this stuff just break down on its own, it will become as loamy and humusy as the bottom of a forest floor. Added to your compost, it's basically the best ingredient that you can chuck into your browns, or what I'm going to use this year is for some slower growing parts of the garden. I'm going to throw this straight on top of some beds to act as a natural mulch. The next one's one I actually picked up from an artisanal baker, and it's to do with your potting area. Keeping some sort of a wide brush around makes it an absolute breeze to clean up, because you just sweep all of the soil straight into something like a bucket or a tray. It takes about 2 seconds, and it's much easier and cleaner than trying to scrape it up by hand or like with a trowel or anything else. If you have an outdoor area under a deck or a patio where you have things like high humidity loving plants, like indoor plants or plants made for part shade that usually come from the rainforest, a great thing to do to help raise the humidity around this area is you can put trays or containers underneath here, or like these storage containers, which this one is actually my moss propagation chamber, is when you're watering them, all of the runoff will gather underneath, or you can just fill the trays straight away themselves. And when scientists have tested this, they found that the air directly above these trays, the humidity gets raised by about 8%, which is not insignificant, especially if you're going from 0 to 8%. And it's also just a great way to help capture some of the water that would be going in between the pots and straight onto your deck or onto your lawn. And this is also great for things like seedlings and propagations and cuttings. Capsicums and chilies, even though they are in the same family as many annuals, such as tomatoes and eggplants, these are actually perennials, which means that they live for many years. The thing is, you just got to know what to do with them during the winter in whatever climate you're in. Speaking of winter, it's decided to finally show up, so I can actually show you what you need to do with your capsicums and peppers in order to overwinter them. Now, what we need to start by doing is removing any fruit from it. You'll find that towards the end of the season you get a lot that just doesn't develop enough, and you can just snip it off, and you can be quite aggressive with the pruning. You can basically strip it all the way back to just the core trunk, or you can leave some branching on there. Oh, and do you like my beanie? Because this is something that I actually made myself from about $12 of Australian clearance wool. And the reason I know how to do that is because of today's sponsor, Craftsy. Craftsy is your online resource for all things creative: sewing, baking, gardening, crocheting, knitting, and heaps more. If there's a creative hobby that you're interested in looking at, it's a perfect platform. That's because it has such a fantastic mix of resources for you to learn any new hobby. To make this beanie, I started by doing the crocheting in the round, mixing and matching hats course by Stacey Trock. Then once I got the hang of it, I used the articles to find a pattern that I really liked to make this specific one. They also have live classes taught by real experts that you get to watch, follow along with, and ask real questions and interact with in real time. Now that we've given our capsicums a really hard prune, if you are subtropical or warmer, you can just leave them in the ground. If you're in about zone 9B or cooler, we are going to want to dig these up and pot them up and then bring them to an undercover area for the rest of the season. I am in zone 9B, which is about right on the limit of where we could leave them in the ground. If this is near something like a brick wall that will retain a bit of heat, I can absolutely leave them in the ground. Now for the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description, you can get a 12-month subscription to Craftsy for only $1.49. And the last time we did one of these limited offers, they did sell out, so make sure to get in quick. So thank you to Craftsy for getting behind this episode of Culinary Garden. Then once you've got them like this, all you need to do is just keep them dry and under cover. If you've got a greenhouse, that's obviously going to be the best spot, but if not, you can just keep them under cover on a patio or even in your shed because they don't need sunlight when they're like this. But if you do, just make sure to watch for once they start putting out leaves and new growth again, because that's when you do need to move them back outside into the sun and start watering them. But while they're under cover, don't water them. The only enemy here is if you keep them too wet, they will start to rot. This is the best method of starting lettuce seeds ever. And this is unashamedly stolen from Charles Downing. Also, how nice is this red maple over here? It's a Japanese maple bonsai. And it's just such a nice vibrant red right now that I have to show it off because I have a feeling next time I'm filming, the leaves will have fallen off. But anyway, lettuce seeds. Now there are a couple steps to this, but this is actually easier for lazy gardeners than doing something like sowing them directly into seed pots. Trust me. So I'm going to start with something just wide and flat, like these little seed trays that you get from Bunnings when you buy stuff like onion seedlings. I've got a handful of these around, but these are perfect for getting lettuce started. I've just filled them up with a seedling mix. If you don't have seedling mix, just use potting mix, should be fine. Lettuce is pretty good. And with this method, it also doesn't matter if we have good or bad germination rates, because you'll see. We're just going to take our lettuce seeds, sprinkle them over the top, cover that with potting mix. And if you have it available, also just putting some vermiculite on top as well seems to help a lot with germination with lettuce seeds. Vermiculite helps with moisture and nutrient retention. I do have a bigger video on if you want to know what every single ingredient in potting mix does. I'll put it up here, I think, is the corner that YouTube puts it in. But let's come back later and I'll show you the next step to this, which is where this method really comes to life. If you have a fruit tree that you've bought from basically anywhere, a nursery, Bunnings, anything like that, there's a trap that you can fall into that you've got to keep a little bit on top of for you not to make the tree go a bit sideways. That's because your tree is most likely grafted, which means that we take the roots of one species and just above the roots, we attach or graft on whatever species that we actually want to grow. Like this is a dwarf orange tree, which means that I'm going to get oranges out of here, but this rootstock is something called flying dragon, which is still a citrus tree, but the fruits no one really likes to eat. Cue the one or two people in my comments that will say that they do. But this variety has a whole lot of advantages of being really hardy, growing in difficult soils. And it's also one of the ways that we can create these dwarf varieties is the rootstock helps control the total amount of growth that the tree can put out and keep it a bit smaller and also stick to some smaller root ball sizes so we can grow them in things like pots. But what will happen is that this rootstock actually still wants to grow itself and it will sometimes shoot out these shoots directly from below the graft. And you should be able to see where one tree kind of turns into a side shoot that then becomes the trunk of our actual variety that we're trying to grow. Anything below this point is the rootstock, like this side shoot that is trying to escape. And also, as a hint with flying dragon, if you let them get big enough, it'll produce these spikes. That's one of the ways that you know it's part of the flying dragon and not part of the citrus tree that you're trying to grow. And anytime you see these, you just need to come and snip them off. It's as simple as that, but if you don't do that, you will find that the tree produces some pretty sizable side shoots that don't actually produce the fruit that you want to get. But here you can also see this side shoot, but this is coming out above where the graft is. So this means this is actually the orange tree just trying to produce another branch. So if I want to, I can leave it or I can accidentally snap it off while shooting this video. Oh, I was probably going to leave that there, but oh well. I personally though, because I'm a bit of a crazy plant person, I'm going to try and actually propagate this side shoot into a flying dragon plant so that I can then graft onto it whatever variety that I want. Because if you can start creating your own rootstock, you can then go and take the tiniest cuttings off whatever fruit tree that you want, graft them onto the rootstock, and then have your whole own tree. Any vining plants that you have, like peas, beans, tomatoes, cucumbers, things that climb. If you want them to flower and then fruit quicker, you can actually just pinch the top off. Now it will stop growing in that direction and the plant will then go, oh no, I'm gonna die soon, I better start reproducing. Now this isn't something you should probably do too early to a lot of things, but if you have planted a bunch of, say, beans all at once, you can pinch one or two of them and then get those to fruit earlier, probably by a couple weeks or even a month or so. So that then by the time those beans are ready, you're harvesting them and then the next lot are starting to come through. Same with if those sort of plants have reached the top of your trellis, just pinching off the top, or which also means just cutting off the top, they will stop trying to grow upwards and maybe even over your trellis and they'll just start producing whatever it is you want them to produce. Newly sown seeds, seedlings, propagations, young plants and indoor plants all prefer being watered with warm water than they do with cold water. If you can get your water temperature somewhere between about 20 to 26 degrees Celsius, by watering with warm water, you're going to help keep the plant in the right temperature range to think that it's the correct part of the growing season, to trigger the right hormone responses to help push out new growth. Similarly, all of these plants will prefer getting watered with rainwater than they will with tap water. So if you can be bothered capturing rainwater and then watering all of these sort of sensitive plants with warm rainwater, which you can just do through most warmer months just by leaving it out during the day, or doing something like getting an old kettle, they will grow so much better than cold tap water. And you don't have to spring for an expensive rainwater collection, just doing something like putting out a couple buckets, or you can also buy kits online that just tap directly into your existing guttering that will help you harvest an extra 100 litres or so at a time, anytime it rains. Those are good introductory solutions instead of splashing out for a full-on rain tank setup. Speaking of rainwater, one of the concepts that's really difficult for new gardeners and even fairly experienced gardeners to wrap their head around is how much rainwater actually waters the garden when it rains. And something I think a lot of people will be shocked by is how dry the soil can still end up after a pretty decent looking rainfall. So something I recommend you do for a fair while, and I still do basically all the time, is get a fairly wide surface area bucket and leave it near your garden beds. And even after some really heavy rainstorms, like a full afternoon of it getting just smashing down on your garden, you'll come out and you'll notice that there's barely any water in the bucket and you realize that, oh my God, rain doesn't actually water the garden that much, or sometimes it might just be lightly sprinkling for a couple of days and you come out and the bucket's completely full. Leaving something like this out here next to your garden that's going to collect rainwater instead of just going off vibes will help you get in touch with how much water your garden's actually getting and how much it needs far more quicker than just about any other method I've ever encountered. One of the best steps that we've found towards actually using all the produce in the garden and also not doubling up by buying stuff in the supermarket that we already had ready to go in the garden is just creating some sort of visual representation of what's ready to go in the garden in the kitchen, somewhere like on a fridge, a whiteboard on the fridge, or maybe on the pantry, so that when we're looking around to work out what we're going to make for lunch or at mealtime, or what we can include in a meal that we're already cooking, you have something right in front of your face to remember what's actually out in the garden and ready to go. Even though I'm out in the garden every day, it's genuinely shocking how bad I am at remembering what's out there when I'm in another mode like cooking, but this makes it so much easier. Once they're growing, carrots are one of the easiest crops to grow, and you can grow them year round through most climates, especially in all of Australia, but that doesn't mean that once the weather cools off, that they aren't a bit of a pain in the bum to actually get germinating. And that's mostly because they have a really sensitive taproot, which is what the carrot is, and they really, really don't like being transplanted. If you touch it, it can just really deform the carrot or it can just kill the plant entirely. But that doesn't mean that we can't pull a full nifty tricks to try and make our life a bit easier. The first hurdle we want to overcome is we need the seed just to stay nice and damp for about 14 days for them to germinate, which is a really long time by most seed standards. And if they're outside in direct sown, that can be a bit of a problem. And the other thing is that even though they will grow quite well during the cold, it doesn't mean that they love germinating in the cold. So we do want to try and get them some sort of heat. Now, a solution for this is to reuse things like toilet roll holders, like I have here, or even spare egg cartons. These actually all work quite well. This type of cardboard generally will degrade quick enough once you plant it out to where the carrot will be undisrupted once it actually grows in. This way we can actually get our carrots started and then transplanted out into the garden and have a much higher success rate than trying to transplant them with seed cells. Next, anything can be a mulch. The definition of mulch is actually something that just stops light from getting through to the soil, which is why sometimes you might search for mulch in Google and you'll just get sheets of what look like tarp, because that's the type of mulch that some agricultural places use. But for some slower growing parts of the garden, things like fruit trees or edible perennials, using things like hedge trimmings or bush trimmings, lots of leaves, fallen leaves, these are all great alternatives to store-bought mulch. In fact, one of the oldest methods of mulching involves the first month of spring, just letting the fields grow like crazy, coming along, and then once they're at about a meter or so tall, slashing that off at the base, let that fall where it is, all kinds of grasses and weeds and cover crops, and wherever that lays is then now your mulch for the next season. Now you probably don't want to do that at home because it'll look a bit ugly for a while, but using things like hedge trimmings, or I have a chopped down tree stump that still produces a whole bunch of these shoots, which I have now dubbed the mulch factory. That's exactly where all of these come from. And these will all eventually break down and just become more garden soil. You can absolutely use methods of mulching like this on veggie beds. It's just that daintier veggies like leafy greens won't be able to really push their way through and around this anywhere near as easily as they will things like straw mulch. Or if you want to save some money on mulch but still have something that looks nice, chuck this sort of stuff underneath, and then on top put on whatever sort of wood chips or straw or whatever type of visually aesthetic looking mulch that you want on top of this. And if you can mix lots of different types of plants into this sort of mulching and use it on things like pathways, you're actually just going to be creating a compost pile in your pathways that walking on top of it will actually help it get broken down quicker. Something you'll probably come across a fair bit are these miniature greenhouses for seedlings, and you might wonder if these are worth it. And I mean, they do an all right job. They're especially good for once you actually have seedlings established, but if you're just trying to get seeds to germinate, these really aren't necessary. Something that will do an even better job is just a bit of plastic across the top, like an old plastic bag, or even just a bit of cardboard over the top will do an incredible job at helping to lock in the moisture and regulate the temperature that will get seedlings to germinate really quickly. And when they're trying to push up into this, it's not going to damage them as long as you remove this within a week or so, the seedlings starting to emerge. While I show you the next tip, I do want to give a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. Please consider checking it out if you do want to support the channel, or consider buying a hoodie. There are a couple sizes that are out of stock, but they'll be restocked soon. And if you have bought one of these, consider tagging me on Instagram with it, because that'd be the awesomest thing to see, someone out there actually repping culinary garden gear. I noticed a few people from gardening businesses have bought them, which is not a market that I thought of, but of course, I'm very proud that there's probably some landscapers out there wearing them. Now, getting dirt under your fingernails is honestly one of the great pleasures of gardening, and there's heaps of science to show that touching dirt and the microbes that are in there will lead to a whole range of health benefits, from things like gut microbiome all the way to helping to reduce stress and anxiety, or just through the power of microbes. But that doesn't mean that one of the great inconveniences of gardening isn't also getting dirt under your fingernails when you don't want that to happen. Say like when you have dinner guests over and you don't want to be serving them charcuterie with black French nails, they might get a little bit iffy about that. The best way to deal with this is actually prevention with just a simple bar of soap. Anytime that you're going to be gardening and that evening or night, or maybe the next day, that you don't want dirt under the fingernails, you can just give a bar of soap just a little bit of a scratch, and you will build up this nice little protective layer underneath your nails that will prevent dirt from getting under there, and the soap washes away so much easier than dirt does. If you've ever tried to propagate something from a cutting, such as a tree or fruit tree, or some herbs or shrubs, or maybe succulents or aesthetic plants, you've probably seen in nurseries and bunnings that you can buy a product called rooting hormone. And you might have wondered, does this stuff actually work? Yeah, it does. It contains a hormone called IBA, which is essentially the signal that the plant sends to itself to say, you need to make more roots here. And it does work really well, but it is pretty expensive. So if you want something that's a bit of an alternative that you might have around, what you can use is an aloe vera plant. Now, aloe vera doesn't actually contain that IBA. It doesn't contain the hormone that's going to help it root. But what it does contain is a whole bunch of awesome antimicrobial stuff that will really help keep your cutting healthy and help it not get infected, help it not start rotting before the plant has its natural chance to start rooting, which there is a lot of stuff that will readily set root without the help of rooting hormone. To use it, you can rub the aloe vera gel just on any cuts or open wounds, or what you can also do is if you snap this in half, you can plant your cutting directly in this and then chuck this in soil. Or same with burns, you can scrape out the middle jelly part of the aloe vera, dilute it with some water, and actually just create your own little antimicrobial spray. Oh, and in case you're wondering, aloe vera is very easy to propagate. You basically snap a piece off, chuck it in some soil or sand or something it might grow in, and you'll get your own plant. This next one's not just garden advice, but is almost life advice. So my fiance's a nurse, and she has been for 10 or so years, and there's this product that she always keeps around the house and in first aid kits and everything that I had never heard of until I started dating a nurse, and it's genuinely is quite mercurial for just about every ailment. It's called Medicream, formerly Mediquattro. This is kind of an all-in-one injury cream that is an antiseptic and anesthetic. It helps with burns and cuts and all those kinds of tiny injuries that we usually get in the garden. This stuff is perfect for all of that. Genuinely, get a tube, always have it in your house or your car or whatever. You'll be shocked at how good of a job it does when you have hurt yourself and you don't really know how to treat it, because not all of us are medical experts, and you just kind of chuck it on and then it's a lot better than nothing. Especially because I found out the other day, did you know that tetanus doesn't actually exist in rusty stuff? It mostly exists in soil. It's just that people would cut themselves on rusty bits of metal and then get infected with the bacteria from soil. So now that I know that, I'm taking cuts and stuff so much more seriously in the garden, and this is a pretty decent step towards getting a bit more serious about safety for those of us who are still really lazy and reluctant to do that kind of thing. Not sponsored, it's just really handy to have. One of the easiest ways to be kind to pollinators in your garden and help get additional pollinators to stick around is to create what's called a little bee bar, which is just a little platter of water, and you chuck a couple of rocks and twigs in there that just lets them sit on somewhere and then get a small drink of water. This is really important for places like Australia where we have a lot of solitary bees. Plus they also look really nice in my opinion. It's almost like a little water feature or a little fairy garden. Now to continue on with the best method of starting your lettuce seedlings, and it's about 2 weeks later. It is very cold now. It is properly winter, as you can tell by the maple tree from the first segment has lost all of its leaves. But the lettuce seedlings are still going good. You can definitely grow lettuce through Australian winter. These have gone a little bit longer than I would normally let them. You can start this method from as soon as the seedlings emerge, basically, is when we can move on to this next step. So you don't have to let them get as big as this. These have even started to get a little bit leggy, which this method will also help you fix, thankfully. So all you need to move on to the next step is regular seedling tray filled with soil, potting mix. The good thing about this method is if you want to save a bit of money, you can use just normal potting mix here as opposed to trying to err towards a seedling mix. And then we also just need something to pick the seedlings out and transplant them in with. You can use a toothpick, a sewing needle. I have these little garden tweezers, but anything you can use just to help get down to the roots a little bit will help a lot. Now, all you need to do to make this work is you just pick out each individual little seedling, and you'll find that they come out as a root ball pretty well. And then, to use the words of Charles Downing, you just want to bung it in. You just basically shove it in. The roots are really resilient, and the good thing is if they have gone a bit leggy, you can shove it into the soil a little bit further to leave just the leaves above the soil. Firm it down a bit. That's it. We're just going to repeat these with each individual seedling. And if you end up with a clump like this, where you've got a bunch that are all connected really closely together, you really don't have to fret too much. You just need to get them apart with as many roots intact as possible. But it really doesn't matter if you're transplanting these with or without soil. Transplanting these as basically bare rooted, the survival rate is still going to be really, really high. You can literally let them get completely bare root, and you can basically grab the full thing and then still just shove it in. Now they're like this, just look after them like normal seedlings, give them good water, leave them in full sun, and you can pretty much leave them like this for a surprisingly long time. Lettuce doesn't mind getting root bound too long, so it's much better to err on the side of just always starting lettuce than not starting it enough. But you'll also find that once you've got them like this, their survival rate is going to be basically 100%, and you now have a full tray of lettuce seedlings. They realistically took not much more effort than trying to sow individual seeds into individual trays. We started by chucking some seeds in, whatever ones actually do make it, we then just transplant, and now we will have this super healthy bunch of lettuce. If you found any of these tips helpful, you'll also want to check out this video because that'll also be a huge help. If there's any other tips similar to these that you know of, please let me know in the comments. Remember to use the link in the description and pick up a year of Craftsy while you can. Thank you very much. Don't buy a hoodie. I'll see you next time.